Hello, this is Arlo Kilpatrick, the erudite Conophile. I'm going to take a brief break from my look into Dr. Maletsky's book, Understanding Bestiality and Zoophilia, because I found something online which I thought was deserving of a response. I was going through a forum called Fur Affinity. Well, it's not a forum really, but those of you who know what it is should correct me on that. But anyway, I did a quick search on that, and I found basically a really rough debate about whether bestiality was in fact permissible. And this interested me because there was an actual citation of a scholarly work which tries to argue that it is in fact not permissible. This scholarly work is done by a man called Piers Beirne, a criminology professor. I won't say at what university because you can look that up yourself, and also because I don't really want to denigrate the university just because I have something against him. You see, he's written a few papers on why bestiality should be considered immoral, essentially, and trying to justify the disgust that many people feel about it. He does expose a lot of the worst arguments as well about this, but uh, he makes some pretty bad ones himself, so I thought I would go through a paper of his that he published in 1997, and when I say he published it, we'll get to that in a moment, and we'll go through it. So, before anyone asks, although this was published in the Journal of Theoretical Criminology, guess who edits that volume, or who edited that volume at the time? The founding editor was none other than Piers Beirne. The journal was founded in February of 1997, and this paper was published in August, so that makes it extremely likely that he was the editor at the time when this publication was produced. So, if somebody tries to tell me that this is a peer-reviewed paper against bestiality, I'll say the author reviewed it himself or had people below him review it. So I hardly consider that to count as a peer-reviewed paper. As for Professor Beirne himself, unfortunately his website doesn't list that many publications, and those it does list are books. Self-published books. Well, not self-published, they're published by Oxford University Press, which is in itself somewhat prestigious, but they're not peer-reviewed journal articles, and that's the important part. But none of that touches on the clear bias present in this article against bestiality, which it will be the goal of this video to show, while presenting the arguments made, or the lack thereof, as I think they are, in a manner that is as fair to the author as I can be given my own position. I am going to be what Penn and Teller would call fair and extremely biased. I'll put a link to the abstract of this paper in the video description. Unfortunately, the paper itself isn't free. You have to pay for access to it or have some kind of login to access it. I bought it because, well, I wanted to know what these arguments were. So, let's start with the abstract. Here's the main goal of this paper in Professor Beirne's words. Quote, I argue that bestiality should be understood as interspecies sexual assault because the situation of animals as abused victims parallels that of women, and to some extent that of infants and children, and further, because 1. Human-animal sexual relations almost always involve coercion, 2. Such practices often cause animals pain and even death, and 3. Animals are unable either to communicate consent to us in a form we can readily understand, or to speak out about their abuse. I'll deal with all three of these arguments separately when we get to the actual meat of them, but notice the term here, interspecies sexual assault. This is designed to instill an emotional reaction against this kind of activity. And given the tone of the rest of the paper, that's probably its intended purpose. In very general terms, I'll go into those things more specifically. The argument that these things involve coercion is untrue for the ordinary definitions of coercion. The idea that such practices often cause animals pain and even death is untrue, and besides the point, irrelevant in cases where the animal is not being caused pain and death. And as for the third argument, this is the hardest to get out of, but ultimately, this only has a sliver of legitimacy, and that only in the second half. That is, their inability to speak out directly about their abuse. Now, at the beginning of this paper, to introduce the topic, Professor Beirne claims that he just stumbled upon a pornographic film involving bestiality. And he notes, interestingly enough, that the animals themselves have varied reactions to the sexual contact with humans, from energetic and enthusiastic participation, to boredom and indifference, to extreme horror and pain, depending on the species and various other factors. An ordinary utilitarian examination of these situations would indicate, until further information was furnished, that these acts are perfectly fine in the first case, questionable but not outright wrong in the second, and utterly wrong in the third. This raises the question of how we should approach bestiality in society, and particularly, why it should mostly be reviled and not ignored as a harmless social deviance. He acknowledges that the reaction to bestiality is more often emotional than intellectual, stating that, quote, probably to most of us, bestiality is a disturbing form of sexual practice that invites hurried bewilderment rather than sustained physical intellectual inquiry. Then he goes on to introduce this subject in a historical context, and I won't go into that history here. I have other videos on the history of zoophilia, as that's irrelevant to the topic under discussion. However, his way of describing bestiality, basically a partial listing of the activities described by that term, is going to be interesting when he brings up the topic later. Usually, in law, and here I'm quoting, it refers to sexual intercourse when a human penis or digit enters the vagina, anus, or cloaca of the animal. However, it also entails any form of oral genital contact, including those between women and animals, and even in psychiatry, fantasies about sex with animals. This definition oddly is both too narrow and too broad. Too broad in that fantasies probably shouldn't be included in any serious discussion on the moral implications of bestiality, and too narrow in that it excludes a very obvious case, the insertion of the animal's genitalia into the anus or vagina of a human being. Considering how common these activities are among both male and female bestialists, this is an inexcusable omission, and it's only presented this way to strengthen later arguments against bestiality. He then goes on to describe why, historically, in Christian societies, it was viewed as wrong. Quote, over the ages, three beliefs have persisted about its wrongfulness. It ruptures the natural God-given order of the universe. It violates the procreative intent required of all sexual relations between Christians. And it produces monstrous offspring that are the work of the devil. Professor Beirne describes each of these three in more detail, but I can dismiss all of them for a reason I can give in one word: biology. The theory of evolution utterly destroys the idea that human beings are fundamentally separate from other animal species. Animal behavioral studies prove that many species are in fact sexual opportunists, with sexual behavior far more varied than strictly procreative sex, and although this doesn't make any claim as to whether that's right or wrong, I think that moral arguments can be made that the purpose of sex is not just for procreation, as a matter of fact. And for the third argument, genetics pretty much shows that offspring between human beings and the species they've domesticated is virtually impossible when done naturally. There may be some kind of genetic engineering that could be done, but that would be incredibly complicated considering that these animals have different chromosome numbers and divergent genealogies going back millions of years. So there's not much you're going to be able to do to get around that. You could hybridize, but anyway. Then, despite the string of executions previously described for this crime, Beirne bemoans the fact that bestiality, both in ancient times and currently, is often practiced and rarely prosecuted. To conclude this section, he states, quote, "There has gradually emerged a pseudo-liberal tolerance of bestiality. This he asserts without evidence. Given the recent spate both in the US and abroad of anti-bestiality laws, this is evidently untrue, at least in terms of Western society at large." We then reach the main arguments of the paper. Beirne bemoans the fact that there has been little attention paid to the animal's role in bestiality in academic discourse. I agree with him on this point, but the manner in which he describes the problem is provocative and not conducive of a reasoned debate on the pros and cons of bestiality. And here is a quote which really gets under my skin. "While researchers have examined the physiological consequences of bestiality for humans," and then he cites a paper which does this, "they pay no such attention to the internal bleeding, the ruptured anal passages, the bruised vaginas, and the battered cloaca of animals, let alone to animals' psychological and emotional trauma." Let's just say that this passage didn't ignore the millions of cases where no physical harm is done to the animal, and no psychological harm is done to the animal either, and millions more in which the animal derives obvious pleasure and gains some kind of benefit from it. It's a bad argument anyway, because it presents the worst cases as those by which we should define a moral standard. This same form of argument can be used for any sexual behavior involving at least two creatures. To pick a recent example, and yes, this is emotionally manipulative, but the whole point is to expose this as emotional manipulation. The abduction and repeated rape of Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight, and Jean DeJesus in Cleveland over the course of a decade is obviously reprehensible. Yet, if I were to use that to characterize all heterosexual sex, that would clearly be out of line. He attempts another argument from liberal rights theory, and I'll explain some of the terms being used here in a moment. Quote, "We might insist that if bestiality is engaged in with a mammal, then it is a harm inflicted on a moral patient entitled to the fundamental right of respectful treatment." Now, before I go on, I need to explain what a moral patient is. In liberal rights theory, there are essentially two kinds of entities in a moral situation. Moral agents, which are ordinary, rational human beings, have some responsibility to choose moral outcomes and have the capability to do so. Anything else which has any other being which has sort of moral implications on its rights, including animals, children, the mentally disabled, and so on, would be considered moral patients, because they cannot really be given full responsibility for their actions, and yet they should be protected under the same forms of rights as everybody else. Now,